Oh, hello everyone. Can you see me? The lighting's never right, but maybe that's appropriate because this is sort of a radio show of the mind that happens to be right here on YouTube. But in any case, here we are. Welcome to Adam's Music Box. Share it with your friends. Tell your dog and cat to come on in. So, today I want to talk about decades in music, how they differ. When does a musical decade really begin and end? Because obviously, you have a calendar year. You have a calendar year where, okay, 1970 is the beginning of one decade, 1980 is the beginning of the next decade. But time is an artificial construct, and it's actually quite an annoying one. But it's nevertheless quite useful because it gives us a common language where to put things, where to place events, where we can all relate to them by the same standard weights and measures, if you were. That's a really brief history of time. But for instance, when people talk about the 20th century, obviously, in a formal sense, it began in the year 1900. But in many ways, it began around 1914 when the war, the Great First World War, changed everything for the worse, if you ask me. And we can do the same thing with music. We can look at how, for instance, the first couple or even 3 years of the 60s bore a lot of similarities to the popular music of the 50s. But by the late 60s, we were living in a different world, a different decade. We went from an era where doo-wop was still something very popular to the end of the 60s, where you have Pink Floyd, King Crimson, a different kind of Beatles, a different kind of Who, a different kind of Rolling Stones, a very different kind of Animals. Eric Burdon changed his sound at that time. We have the appearance of the Moody Blues and their unique sound, the appearance of Jethro Tull, of Yes, of Cream, of Led Zeppelin. And so if there was a huge difference, a difference that really felt like more than 10 years between the early 60s and late 60s. And I've talked on this channel a bit before about why I think that is. I think that a lot of it had to do with changes in musical technology. Guitars were becoming much different in their sound because amplification technology grew leaps and bounds between the late 50s and the late 60s. So the electric guitar became louder, more reverberant, grittier, more a richer sonic texture to pull from. And to keep up with that, drum sets had to get bigger and more elaborate. Bass amps obviously grew as guitar amps grew, and keyboards became more numerous in their variety and more unusual in their sound. So, in other words, it wasn't now just, oh, here's a piano and here's an electric piano, here's a pipe organ and here's a Hammond organ. Now we have, here's a mellotron. What's that? Here's a Moog synthesizer. Here are these other new instruments, new tools that make new sounds. And consequently, you have a new decade. And much of the technology and the technological boom of the late 60s went into the 70s, as did a lot of the sociological reasons that music changed. The era of the Tin Pan Alley songwriter gradually, not entirely, but it gradually gave way to both the band that would compose its own music and to the singer songwriter, which, as the name implies, is one person, and he or she is both the writer of the music, the lyricist, and the vocal performer. Sometimes they'll have a guitar or a piano in hand. Well, no, piano would be quite heavy, but you get what I'm saying. So we see a 70s where the styles that emerged in the late 60s started to mature, started to become more refined, in many cases more virtuosic, in many cases the production improved. And when you put all that together with the popularity of album-oriented rock, AOR, which is what that term first stood for and what increasingly it's come to stand for again, we see this genre dominate the 1970s, because AOR was in many ways the logical conclusion of sprinkle a bit of hard rock, a bit of prog rock, a bit of singer-songwriting, a bit of blues rock, a bit of what, for lack of a better term, you could call generic rock, and voila, we've got AOR, which is in many ways the most sophisticated expression of rock as a genre. But below the surface in the 70s, there was a completely different style of music brewing. So while the FM radios of North America were dominated increasingly by the end of the decade by the Journeys of the world, by Foreigner, by REO Speedwagon, by Gary Wright, by, I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of great AOR, but it's Jefferson Starship. All of this sort of thing, Boston. There was an underground scene that was happening, and it was very different. And similar underground scenes were happening in New York and London, and eventually it would spread out to LA only a few years later. Now, mostly this is categorized as punk. Think bands like the New York Dolls and the Ramones in New York. Think a few years later, bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Jam in London. And later on, you had an underground punk scene in LA that took place, that was sort of based in Chinatown in LA, a place called Madame Wong's, because the clubs in West Hollywood, Sunset Strip, Santa Monica Boulevard, those types of things, those bands, those clubs were really rock clubs. And by this, we mean sort of hard rock, aspiring AOR artists, aspiring heavy metal artists, and they didn't get along with the punks, which in the LA scene, you had this duality whereby the people who came to LA to hard rock, they were mostly from working or lower middle class backgrounds, where the punks tended to be wealthier kids from the valley rebelling against suburbia. In the UK, things were somewhat different. You had a punk scene that was genuinely working class, but there were always these middle class artists that some would say inspired the movement, some would say infiltrated, some would say corrupted. Then you have the whole dynamic of the Clash, a band that was kind of middle class, but sort of LARPing, pretending to be working class. And then you had people like John Lydon and the rest of the Sex Pistols, who, even though they were put together by someone who was a fashion designer, they were the real deal. They came from those difficult backgrounds. John Lydon, very ill, very poor as a kid. I did a video about him just the other day. But in terms of the longevity of musical influence, it was the New York scene that really gave birth to what we now refer to as New Wave. So somewhere along the way, the Ramones gave way to Blondie. And then hence we see a more melodic type of music born out of that New York punk sound. And it spread around this underground world. Now, Blondie began underground at CBGB's, but they conquered the charts, and they paved the way for bands like Devo, who began as very avant-garde to achieve a chart success, and bands like the Cars to become one of the very biggest bands in this new style in the late 70s and early 80s. Now, I think one of the things that we need to get away from is that these two styles, that one sort of destroyed the other. That was briefly true in the UK, but only briefly, because Pink Floyd were very popular in the late 70s and early 80s. So were Genesis. So were a lot of the big, so were Bad Company, these bands from the UK. They weren't killed off by punk. Some didn't fare as well. ELP didn't fare as well, for instance. Robert Fripp of King Crimson embraced this new New York sound fully. So I think that journalists, and many times, like to simplify things a bit too much in terms of, oh, this kind of music killed off this kind of music. At some times in history, that does happen. But in the late 70s, all of this stuff coexisted. And I think we really need to remember that. Then you can look at another virtuosic band that was really of this new style, but didn't eschew the virtuosity that its various members learned from the jazz world, Andy Summers, or the prog rock world, Stuart Copeland, or even the sort of rock meets singer-songwriter meets jazz world, Sting. Who am I talking about? I'm, of course, talking about the Police, who became huge in the late 70s and early 80s. And they proved that bands that were sort of this new mindset, of this new style, a little bit punky, a little bit new wave. And I guess the difference between new wave and punk is similar attitude, but new wave is a bit less political, a bit more in tune, and in some cases virtuosic, where punk's whole ethos was that it's the music that anyone could play. You study the guitar for a week or two and you can be in a punk band. Not quite that simple, but that was the ethos, the underlying ethos behind that. So of these artists, we have to look at what they went on to do, because as John McLaughlin said, all music is ultimately fusion music. And two people from this new wave scene and punk scene, I'm going to group them together for the sake of ease, went on to create fusion masterpieces in the 80s. I'm referring to Sting, whose first album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, was all about a fusion between singer-songwriting, very contemporary forms of jazz and rock. And I'm also referring here to John Lydon, who formed PIL, Public Image Limited, a band that was really a fusion of progressive rock, punk, and minimalism. And they were really successful. And because the media couldn't run with them the way that it found a way to run with John Lydon's previous band, the Sex Pistols, they didn't get the publicity that they needed, in spite of their name, I know. And then you have artists, I mentioned Robert Fripp, of the old school, who ended up becoming innovators at this time. Robert Fripp, on his second album, worked with Peter Gabriel. Now, if you're talking about two of the titans of prog rock that all punksters are supposed to hate, King Crimson and Genesis, but these guys, using new instruments like the Fairlight CMI, in Peter Gabriel's case, new production techniques, experiments with minimalism, did stuff in this late 70s, early 80s era that invented the sounds of the 80s. And this gets us to our next point in this journey, this difference between decades. The late 70s, you hear a knock on the door because it's, hello, I'm the 80s. I'm almost here. You better get ready for me. And musicians were ready, because the underground of the 70s combined with the mainstream of the 70s to create the sound of the 80s. Now, what was the sound of the 80s? Well, let's look first at the drums, because if any instrument really changed in terms of how it was approached between the two decades, that was the drums. Now, the 70s was an era where drums were recorded in a very clean manner. Fundamentally, the way drums were recorded in the 70s and 80s shared similar goals. They wanted a sound that was balanced, that was clear, that wasn't overpowering, and that was natural. In the 60s, this was mainly accomplished through a few overhead mics, which didn't get much detail, but definitely got a clean sound. In the 70s, as multi-track taping came in, people became more enthusiastic about miking the hell out of the drum set, not compared to the excessiveness that we see today. But you saw multi-miking, pardon me, which gave the drums a much more detailed sound. Every ride on the cymbal, no matter how gentle, was crisp. Every crash of a crash cymbal didn't distort, because you had a microphone close to it. You could level, you could work on the gain to accomplish that. Less true in the 60s. The tom-toms, close miking. And you had a nice, clean drum sound. Think just any great recording, whether a very understated drum sound like Nick Mason in Dark Side of the Moon, whether one that was a bit more upfront but ultra clean, think the drums of Steely Dan. Think of something in between, like Ted Templeman's production of the Doobie Brothers. Just about anything from the 70s had that sound. There were always exceptions. You can't always paint with a broad brush, but these trends were observable. Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins did what they could to totally change that. And this was this gated reverb sound, which gave the drums a sort of harrowing a crash. Think of any of the stuff on Peter Gabriel's third album where Phil Collins played on a number of tracks. Think the song Intruder. Listen to the snare drum sound on that. That was the sound of the 80s, and it was invented within the final 2 years of the 1970s. Phil Collins used this drum sound to great effect on his first solo album, Face Value. So we really could hear the 80s coming in the air tonight. And so everyone then wanted that gated sound. Def Leppard took it to total extremes. Everyone was using it though. Miles Davis used that drum sound. Jazzers were using it. Everyone was using it. And to complement this, you had two other interesting occurrences happen in the world of percussion. You had the arrival of the Simmons electronic drums, whose sound could sometimes be confused for a real drummer playing on a heavily gated reverb sound, because it was very loud, very in your face, but it was very metallic. Is the best way to describe it. And then you add the sequencers and drum machines, which by no coincidence sounded similar to Simmons. So if the Simmons drums sometimes sounded similar to real drums recorded with gated reverb, and if drum machines sounded similar to Simmons drums, you have a drum sound of the 80s that was much more metallic, much more in your face, much more distinctive. It was a kind of drum sound that, unlike the more natural drum sound of the 70s, it just begged to be in your face. Next, what happened? Polyphonic synthesizers got cheaper. So when the synthesizer got invented, as we know it, the keyboard synthesizer, Robert Moog being the pioneer of that, it wasn't polyphonic. You could only play one note at one time. It couldn't play chords. And so you have this advent of the lead synth, where necessity being the mother of invention, synthesizers became a place where usually the right hand of a right-handed keyboardist could go wild. Meanwhile, his left hand was holding down the chords. Think Chick Corea's lead synth solos in Return to Forever. Think Rick Wakeman's lead solos. Think Keith Emerson. And that wonderful sound is now in your mind. By the mid-70s, very expensive polyphonic synths came, which allowed bands like Tony Banks of Genesis, Stevie Wonder, John Paul Jones, Keith Emerson to play these polyphonic sounds. And I'm thinking in particular of a very expensive synth called the GX1 by Yamaha, that was owned by one was owned by Stevie Wonder, one was owned by Keith Emerson, one was owned by John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, one was owned by Benny Andersson of ABBA. And Yamaha had a lot of other successful synths, Eddie Jobson, who were famous for being in UK, but also Roxy Music, a bit of Jethro Tull, a bit of Frank Zappa. He had some of the Yamaha keyboards that were really innovative at that time. ELO used them. And by the dawn of the 80s, this stuff was getting cheaper, which opened up synthesizers to become instruments that shape the chordal textures of the music, meaning you didn't need a piano, an organ, or a guitar to have a rich, thick, heavy, interesting, modern sounding chordal harmonic structure to your music. And this gave way to the synth pop bands. Some of them were known as the New Romantic bands. And it also gave way to many traditional bands like Rush adopting this sound. Yes, adopting these keyboards. And it allowed these synthesizers to really, I don't want to say replace in a negative sense, but it allowed them to fulfill a role that through much of the 70s and all of the 60s was only fulfilled by the piano, electric or otherwise, or the organ, or the mellotron, which wasn't a synthesizer, but it kind of behaved like one, but it was notoriously more cumbersome than these new polysynths. And don't get me wrong, as like I said, bands like Genesis and others, ELO, ELP, they were using these polysynths in the 70s, but they got much more ubiquitous by the end of the decade and into the 80s. And so from punk to new wave, now we have synth pop, we have the new romantic music, and we have mainstream rock musicians incorporating these keyboards and this modern drum sound into AOR. So AOR, far from going away, it evolved. Toto used these synthesizers in a virtuosic setting. Asia was the 1980s answer to the prog rock of the 70s. Genesis and Yes became of that same style as well. You had bands like I said, Def Leppard with that huge drum sound. You had Journey, full of polysynths, played by Jonathan Cain. Um, think of the name, Separate Ways, Worlds Apart. Synthesizers were really taking the lead in establishing the chordal textures of that song. And so punk and new wave fed the synth pop people of the 80s, your Depeche Modes, your Buggles, your ABCs, your Talks, your Thompson Twins, your Duran Durans. And at the same time, there was a feedback loop created that allowed these new sounds to become adopted both by the new AOR bands that made it big in the 80s. Toto started in the 70s, but they really became big in the 80s, and bands like Journey started in the 70s, became even bigger in the 80s. Foreigner, look at all the polysynths on I Want to Know What Love Is, one of the best produced songs of all time. And so the 80s was really defined not so much by the end of one genre and the beginning of another, because the punk survived the 80s and became the second generation of new wave or synth poppers. A lot of the AOR and even the prog bands survived. A lot of the heavy metal bands survived, adopting that new drum sound. Some even adopted a lot of synth sound. Think Rainbow in the Dark on Dio's first album. At first, I think, do we want synthesizer on this? It really, really made the song. They made the right decision. Think of Van Halen, not sort of heavy metal, but hard rock. And Eddie, much to the displeasure of David Lee Roth, said, no, we're going to be a band where keyboards are very important. And voila, their biggest hit is more about the keyboards than about the guitars. I'm thinking Jump. So again, this feedback loop. So again, let's just catalog this. So what makes the sound of the 80s? Polysynths everywhere, and in some cases, they replace the role of the guitar, piano, and organ as the main chordal and harmonic instrument in a band. Thing two, drums that don't sound like natural drums. This is whether they're electronic drums by Simmons, who was the main maker of them, drum machines and sequencers, or recording regular old acoustic drums with this gated reverb and similar effects, giving it that metallic, in-your-face type of sound. Guitarists, of course, had to respond, and so the typical 80s guitar sounded closer to the synthesizer than before. And this was done both through guitar synths, it was in the later part of the decade done through MIDI, and it was also done with effects that just gave guitar a lot of reverb, a very thick and sometimes amorphous sound. Pardon me. And then, of course, there's the bass, or as you might call it, the bass. And several new techniques developed in the bass. Slap bass became ubiquitous in the 80s. John Entwistle, one of the great bass players of all time, he occasionally would slap. And people picked up on it. Some funk bass players, Bootsy Collins, and by the 80s, everyone was slapping the hell out of their bass, getting that very percussive sound out of the bass. Mark King from Level 42, hugely influential in the way the 80s bass sounded. Level 42, definitely a band that pioneered this 80s sound, incorporating some jazzy and soulful elements into this synth pop in a virtuosic setting. All of the guys in Level 42 were virtuosos. Another thing that happened in the 80s was the popularization of the fretless guitar, the fretless bass guitar, that is. Now, fretless bass was prominent in the 70s in the world of jazz fusion, but not really anywhere else. You had people like Alphonso Johnson with wonderful solo albums, was in Weather Report, and then another very famous Weather Report bassist, Jaco Pastorius. Two guys who really made that fretless bass sound well known, and it has generally a smoother sound than a fretted bass. It almost sounds more like an acoustic bass, but with an electric feel than your traditional fretted bass guitar. In the 80s, you saw a lot more, and don't get me wrong, most bass in the 80s was still fretted, but you saw a lot more fretless bass in rock and pop than you ever would have done in the 70s or in the 90s. Think, for instance, Tommy Franklin. Hold on one second. I want to make sure. I know he's Franklin, but I want to make sure I got his name correct, Tony Franklin. So he was with a band called The Firm. They were a super group in the 80s, and really one of my favorites. It was Jimmy Page from Zeppelin on guitar, vocalist Paul Rogers. You had Tony Franklin on the fretless bass. Really, really wonderful stuff. It really I honestly say, as great as everyone was in the band, it was that unique sound of the fretless bass that really gave the Firm a unique sound. Then you had people like Pino Palladino becoming one of the biggest session bass players of that era, along with Tony Franklin, who did lots of session work. And he didn't always play fretless, but when requested, he did, and it had that unique sound. And so here we have this 80s sound. And when you put it all together, what did the 80s sound like? Well, they sounded very futuristic. Because the 80s was such a big break in terms not of the styles of music as much as the way that the music was produced, the instruments used to make it, the way that the songs were mastered. The 80s was a clean break from the 70s style. Now, the 70s style has aged better because a natural production style will always sound more timeless than one that dared to be so very different. The 80s was consciously, in terms of all of these things, the arrangements, the instruments, the production, it was consciously different in the way it sounded. And by the time the 90s came around, there were the new punks. Meet the new punks, same as the old punks. These were the grunge artists who really changed the way that music in the rock world sounded. So the question is, where did this 80s sound live on? Did it die? Or did it not die? Well, in the rock world, it did die. In the 90s, say farewell to your gated drums. Simmons drums are now lame. Synthesizers, boo. More very natural sounding guitar, yes. Let's have smaller drum sets. Let's be smaller. Let's be Nirvana. Let's be Pearl Jam. Let's be Alice in Chains. Let's be Stone Temple Pilots. But did the 80s sound die? No. It went into hip hop because all of these sounds, all of these technologies, all of this attitude about what percussions should sound like, what synths should sound like, what rhythmic patterns should function for, that became all the more prominent in the hip hop of the 90s when some of the best hip hop producers, people like Dr. Dre, people like Warren G, people like DJ Quick, people like Sir Jinx, people like DJ Pooh, they were heavily invested in using a combination of both real and sampled polysynths. They integrated even some lead synths. They were heavily invested in that drum machine sound. Rather than using a natural sounding percussive background. And so all of those innovations that made the 80s what it was actually went into the genre that made the 90s that pivotal genre where it was the lost stand of rock and roll and the total ascendance of hip hop into the mainstream. And now when you think about it, all pop music is all about being derived from the hip hop sound of the 90s. And if the hip hop sound of the 90s owed so much to the pop, rock, funk, soul, R&B sound of the 80s, we really are still living in the 80s. Because when you listen to a pop song today, it's generally going to be driven by some sort of synthetic sound, maybe even AI. Well, AI isn't a synthesizer in the way that people in the music world would think about it. It is synthesized music. We very rarely hear natural sounding drums anymore. They came back in the 90s and early 2000s. They're gone now. It's all heavily processed, synthesized drums in the major pop music of today. You're not going to hear a drummer sounding like Dave Grohl, who maintained his 90s sound, on a Taylor Swift song. And so, did the 80s have the lost love? Did this decade that is so dated because all of these things that sounded so futuristic now sound it's so quintessentially 80s. I hear a bit of Aha or a bit of Flock of Seagulls, and I think of shoulder pads and Ronald Reagan and front wheel drive cars and all of that stuff, but the 80s did have the lost love in many ways because the pop music of today, which was influenced by the hip hop production styles of the 90s, all owed itself to the new sonic realities of the 80s that themselves were pioneered by the punks and the new wavers of the 70s with a little help from the old heads, your Robert Fripps and your Peter Gabriels and your Phil Collins. What does it show you? There's nothing new, there's just perpetual innovation. And I guess that's a good place to. This is really more of a rant than a traditional live stream, but hey, what can you do about it? Remember, this is a new, young YouTube channel, so like and subscribe. Share it to your friends or your enemies. A like or a view from them is as good as a view from a friend. Share it around and let me know what you think. Comment and do all the rest of it. We will see you, of course, next time. Take care.